As the country struggled over the past year with the pandemic and a racially divisive presidency, there was a surge in protests and even some acts of destruction. But the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on January 6th took that surge to another level because the target and because it was so explicitly encouraged by President Trump. As a result, many people are asking, how did this happen? At Lawyers for Civil Rights, that question is also being posed as a national conversation about race and equality. To give us some perspective is a staff attorney from the organization, Arielle Sharma. Thank you very much for being with us, Arielle.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Arielle, I want to start with the sense of alarm here. You watched the live coverage of this event, probably. How did you feel about it?
And while we felt, and many of us at Lawyers for Civil Rights felt that this was extremely frightening, it wasn't necessarily shocking to us. It seems that the assault on the Capitol is directly rooted in the unique social and historical dynamics that we've seen in the United States. Over the last 4 years, we've seen a direct assault on the beliefs of democracy and certainly the ideals of equality that so many people come to this country for. And this was just a culmination of that.
What about the optics? Maybe you don't have to be a real history buff or an old film buff, but there's a picture in that storming that must have affected people. How did that play in their minds, you think?
The picture that really stands out to me from that, from the storming of the Capitol was the white supremacists carrying a Confederate flag in the halls of the Capitol. Part of what's important to me about that is that we see him, while he's holding the flag of the Confederacy, he's standing in front of a portrait that I understand to be of John C. Calhoun, who was an architect of the rebellion of the Civil War. And so while these white supremacist terrorists brought the Confederate flags and other symbols of hate, they didn't bring that portrait. That portrait was already there, and symbols of hate have been sitting in our halls of democracy for far too long.
Chris, the other thing that's important here is, on the surface, this is supposed to be a group of people who felt they had a grievance. They thought the election was unfair, but I mean, talk about what was underneath that surface grievance.
I think what we can't forget is that this attempted coup happened on the same day that Georgia elected their first Black senator. Those events can't be separated. The events on at the Capitol, the attempted coup, the insurrection, was an attack directly on democracy and directly on the voices of Black and Brown people. Where the election, particularly that in Georgia, was a symbol of increased voter turnout from Black and Brown communities. And we saw that result. And that was directly what was being attacked by these white supremacist terrorists who came to the Capitol. There is a long history in our country of disenfranchisement of Black and Brown voices. At Lawyers for Civil Rights, what we do every day is fight to make sure that those people are heard and that they are protected. This assault on the Capitol feels like a step up and another step towards violence against those communities. And we're committed to standing next to, and when we can, in front of those communities to protect them from state violence or the violence of the people around us. We are guaranteed equality and protection under law, and that's what Lawyers for Civil Rights stands for.
I know in the earliest coverage here, I think there was a lot of attention to the obvious. A lot of people who might have been leading it, at least from close up, were mentally unstable, maybe crazed by conspiracy theories. In other words, we looked at them as sort of small time figures. But is this really a story about small timers, uh, going too far?
Although there may have been a relatively small number who were at the protest, the underpinnings were not small. This is rooted in a long history of racism in America. The President Donald Trump and his administration have only brought that out, and they've brought it to the forefront, but they haven't created it. It sits in the monuments that have been at issue over the past year to Confederate and racist leaders that still stand in places of prominence. We cannot normalize white supremacy, but we can't ignore that it's always existed in this country. We continue to call it out, and the language that we're using around this incident really does matter. These were not protesters, these were white supremacists, and they come from a long history and dynamics in history and social interaction that are truly the basis of our country. And while we continue to march towards equality and understanding of one another, it's important that we continue to recognize that this is not new and it is not surprising, because it is embedded in our justice system, in our cultural history, and in our legislature.
Full-time, we say white supremacists, we think of people who are fixated on race all the time, fringe group people, but there are a lot of people in Congress who are buying into the central narrative behind that protest. What about them?
For a long time I'll say in the recent past, the idea of being called a racist has been treated as being worse than actually being racist. It's one of the ways that we have hid our language and allowed people a pass. The idea of being colorblind, the idea that there's such a thing as being able to be colorblind when our entire system is based on the backs of Black and brown oppression. I think unconscious bias is rampant. And while people think that because I've never gone out and shot someone or called someone the N-word or, vandalized a church, that I'm not a racist, is prominent. That idea is prominent in our country, but it's not the truth. Everyone, when you grow up in this country, everyone has a bit of racism embedded in them because it's embedded in our culture. And we have to actively work to root it out. We can't just passively expect that it'll be gone.
What about preventing acts in the future like what happened on January 6th? Because people are saying that there's also sort of a national security angle here, that if protest goes too far, we're going to be in deep trouble. That to me sounds like it's also going to be a recipe for more crackdowns on demonstrations, almost regardless of which end of the political spectrum they come from. Do we have to worry about that?
Lawyers for Civil Rights is demanding that there be an investigation into the muted police response to this incident, but particularly the muted police response in comparison to Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen over the past years. The disparity in response concerns us, not because we necessarily want stronger responses to all protests, but we want equal responses to all protests. Threats can come from any end of the spectrum and they have to be taken seriously. At the same time, the First Amendment is important and we do recognize that. However, the First Amendment is to be protected in court. We are asking that these people have to follow the same laws as everyone else, which is if they believe they have a First Amendment right, they need to be charged, they need to be prosecuted, and that is a defense that can be launched in court. It is not that they get a free pass because they walk around screaming First Amendment. It's not how the law works. This whole coup was about taking over and displacing due process and the rule of law. And at Lawyers for Civil Rights, we stand for the Constitution and we stand for the communities that we protect.
Chris, the other thing I see in this protest here is a message about, xenophobia, messages about, what's really American cultural consistency. This goes all the way back to that essay, the Flight 93 election that a lot of conservatives rallied around. On paper, it's race neutral, but how dangerous is it?
Whenever we have a situation where race is not being called out, it can be extremely dangerous. We continue to demand that the undercurrents be spoken about, um, out loud. So instead of calling people protesters, they were terrorists. It is important that we continue to monitor the language that we're using and to call out racism where we see it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.